Well, that got everybody quiet, so I guess we'll go ahead and start. Good evening. How are you guys doing? Anybody feel tired? I feel tired tonight, so pray for me to find my energy. My wife's been out of town for 4 days now, and so it's just it's hard to be mom and dad at the same time. So, but glad to be here with you tonight. I really am excited about what we're going to talk about tonight. In many ways, everything that we've done so far has been leading us to this. This is kind of the big thing. This is really the thing that I was wanting to kind of get into together. It's going to require probably more of you. I'm not going to ask pointed questions, but really just want to have an open dialogue. So it'd be good for you to move towards the front if you can, if you want to be a part of that. And I really don't know where it's going to go entirely, but we'll see. It'll be great. Okay. But just so that you understand kind of where we're coming from. Tim Keller is a pastor in New York City. His church is named Redeemer, and ours is named Redeemer, and that's not a coincidence. A lot of kind of how we conceived of this church was due to what we learned about the church there in downtown Manhattan, although Winter Haven's a very different place from Manhattan. So what we tried to do all those years ago is to take some of the things that he was thinking through and rethink them for this place. And so he's just been very formative to us. He wrote a book called Center Church, and the whole intent of the book is he's trying to explain what happens with churches in general. Well, with churches in particular is it's called Center Church because he was trying to make the point that the power and the life, the spiritual power is really a matter of being able to stay centered and not allow yourself to get pulled to different extremes. And so with the gospel, you see this. Hey Joe, can it be on the screen in front of me so I can see it without having to turn around? Is that too much trouble? Thank you. The gospel is a matter of staying centered and not allowing yourself to drift to one side or the other. On the one side of the gospel is what we would call relativism. In other words, if you move toward relativism, if you move towards saying there is no right and wrong, there's no moral standard that we have to live up to, a truly irreligious perspective on things, that is kind of a leaving away from the gospel. And so when you find that, what you need to do is the repenting that you do is you pull back away from that, back towards the middle. Does that make sense? But at the same time, what can happen is it's easy to go from being most people go from being an irreligious person, they blow right past the gospel and they go to becoming a religious person, right? And you can, so in the story of the prodigal son, there are two lost boys, right? The goal is I honestly used to believe that the whole lesson of the prodigal son story was that the younger brother should be more like the older brother. Yeah, you thought so too, Gigi? I mean, I really did. Like that, it's just mind-boggling to me that that's how I read that scripture, where Jesus' whole point is that the older brother is just as lost as the younger brother. And what you see in those two people are the two groups of people, the Pharisees and scribes and religious leaders, and then the tax collectors and sinners and all of those people represented in those two characters. And they really are representative of both relativism or irreligion and legalism and religion. And the gospel's neither of those. The gospel's both. And what you have to do is you have to constantly go through life repenting yourself away from both irreligion and religion and back towards the gospel. You're constantly reorienting yourself. So that's what repentance is. Repentance is realizing where you've lapsed into kind of a religious way of living and thinking, and relating to God and moving back towards grace. Does that make sense? So, but the point Keller makes is that it's not just work. It doesn't just work that way with the gospel. It also works that way with what he calls movement. So, Joe, go to the next slide. And in a movement, if what you're really wanting to see is a true, and by movement, just substitute revival. Remember, we're talking about revival. We're asking God for revival. If you really want to see revival, if you really want to see a genuine move of the Spirit, a movement of the gospel in the city of Winter Haven or in Polk County, then you have to avoid similar extremes. And the trick is to find that beautiful middle ground between being overly structured and organized, where you're right? Where how would I'm going to explain it in detail in a minute, but you can become so structured, so hierarchical, so organized that the Spirit has to go through this one tiny little channel, and that's the only direction the Spirit can move, and then it just kind of gets bottlenecked, and you lose all the energy and the momentum. Does that make sense? We'll explain in more detail. But then the other thing is you also have to avoid this purely fluid organization or no sense of organization. Like, in other words, this idea that there's no leadership, there's no hierarchy, there's no rules, there's no procedures, none of that kind of stuff. Really, what you're looking for, if you want to see a sustained move of the Spirit, is you got to find that beautiful middle ground where you're not overly structured and organized, but you're not under structured and organized as well. Does that make sense? And that's what we want to talk about tonight. We want to talk about what it means for us to re-engage with institutions, because so many people are writing about this now. You see it in so many places, because what we're realizing is that institutions are really having a hard time in our culture. And a lot of people are calling us back to a recognition of why institutions like the church, right, and like schools, these social institutions, why they're so important. And the way that our way of living has started to erode our confidence and our commitment to those sorts of things, and trying to recover that. So that's what we want to talk about tonight, okay? And what we're going to do is we're going to talk about each side of that. So I'm going to start with talking about the danger of being too structured, but then we want to also transition to talk about, but what does it mean if just hyper-individualism just takes over and there's no commitment, there's no engagement with the institutions themselves, okay? All right, that was a long-winded intro, but let's talk about this for a minute. So here's the way I want to get into this tonight, if you've been around, or maybe you've heard Tim Hassett and I kind of having this banter with one another recently about programs, about institutionalism. I can tend to talk kind of negatively about institutionalism, about programs, and I just felt like I needed to explain, to say this, that the church is an institution, but it's a unique institution because the mission is the people themselves. Okay? You're going to have to stick with me here. In other words, the people in the church, the people don't work for the institution works for the people. That's what makes the church different. So the people don't work together towards whatever goal or whatever mission the institution has. The people are the goal. The people are the mission. So biblically, the work of pastors is to equip the saints for ministry. Right? That's my job description, according to Paul in Ephesians 4, to equip you for ministry. That is the church in its most distilled form. And so pastoral function, pastoral authority, and whatever organization is necessary to carry those things out toward the building up of all the people toward their work of ministry. That is the church. So any hire the church makes, and I tell our staff this all the time, see, any hire the church makes should be multiplying the work of the saints. We do not hire people here to do works of ministry. We hire people to multiply the workers. Right? Does that make sense? Are you tracking with me so far? Okay. The problem is that discipling, equipping, these things that we're supposed to be doing, they assume a personal relationship between the pastor and the people. And it assumes that all of the pastor's time and energy and focus is going into the people. But what happens, and Eugene Peterson has written about this, and we read these books in seminary and feel guilty about, doing it wrong and all sorts of things. But he's written about how instead of doing that, instead of there being this almost all of their work going towards discipling, equipping, helping, serving the people, pastors can get busy just running the church. And with programs, pastors or staff members or staff's time and energy can get used up in running or organizing the program. So a great example would be the last 6 weeks doing this, right? What we're doing is good, but if you're not aware, can I just go ahead and tell you there's an increased amount of time and energy and conversation being spent securing commitments for people to be over there with the kids while we're here, Connie figuring out what we're going to eat when we try to do a meal for 100 people, volunteers, logistical details. There's an energy expenditure to do this. And the truth is we are finite creatures, which means that energy has to come at the expense of something else. Does that make sense? You still tracking with me? I want to make sure you're following me. Okay? So in some cases, that's necessary, as long as the goal remains that energy has to come at as long as the goal remains the impact that will have on the people. But if we're not careful, it can leave little room to actually do the long, slow, hard work of pastoring and multiplying workers. And if that becomes the case, in other words, if we spend all of our time just making sure the lights are on and somebody's here to turn on the AC and open the door, and we have volunteers for the kids and all this kind of stuff, but nobody's actually doing the work that the church has been called to do, then it's counterproductive to the mission of the church. If the people are busy with church but not being changed, we're doing it wrong, right? So let me say it another way. Let me say one other thing. I went through this dark night of the soul a number of years ago before we planted Redeemer. I was down on the institutional church, that whole vibe, But then I read an interview somebody did with Eugene Peterson, and they asked him if he believed in the institutional church, and his answer I thought was brilliant. He said yes, because he didn't know of any other kind of church. But he said the institutionalism isn't the thing itself, it's the bark on the tree. That was his analogy. It's always stuck with me. He said it was the bark on the tree. It's the dead part that protects what is living inside, but it's the living stuff inside that matters. Right? It's the church's life. It's the people that matter. The organization, the programming, that's just there to protect the other stuff. Remember? Do you remember the dialogue that Jamie and Tim had? We were talking about Jamie said a few weeks ago, she said, I have benefited the most from not necessarily having a parenting seminar or class to go to, but just by being related to other, older women and older men who have helped us parent our kids. And we went back and forth about, right, that's the living thing on the inside. That's what church really should be. But is there a way to build out programs, to build out infrastructure and stuff like that to allow that to happen? Yes, but if you do it to such a degree that all of a sudden all you're doing is maintaining the infrastructure and nobody's actually getting together with other people because you're so busy just running things, do you see how this happens? It becomes a problem. And so just a caution, a church plant doesn't have a lot of structure. It's all organic and relational. And it's beautiful and fun, and a lot of us were there at the beginning. It's frightening and scary and all of that. But as it grows, you have to put up some scaffolding to support and even multiply the beautiful relational stuff. But if you're not careful, the time and energy and focus can shift from the relational stuff to maintaining the scaffolding. Okay? So there's actually a book written about this recently, or not recently, but a number of years ago. It's called The Trellis and the Vine, about needing to distinguish between the real work of the church, the vine work, which is preaching and teaching and praying and discipleship and all of that, and the trellis work, which is structure and support that you have to have in place. And they, I think, hit the nail on the head when they talked about the volunteerism in the church, that what happens is people will often come and say, well, I have gifts, I want help, I want a ministry. And typically what they mean is something like they want to do trellis work. They want to help with the trellis. They want to do trellis work in the church. They want to lead a ministry. They want to serve on a team that's running a program in the church. They want some public role in the organization. And I can tell you that's my experience, because when I've tried to point people to the vine work, when somebody's come to me and said, hey, I have gifts, I want a ministry, I want to help, and then I've pointed them to the vine work, to the people work. When you say, hey, why don't you just go back in your neighborhood and make some friends and start a Bible study, or start a book club with some people and just get together and read something, take some younger women out to lunch and mentor them. I found that that's not the answer people are often looking for. Or let me put it another way. We can't seem to stop thinking of the church as a top-down organization and not a bottom-up. And what I mean by that is that all of the ideas, can I just say we're in big trouble if every idea about ministry has to come from me or Jonathan or from our handful of leaders. What should be happening is ministry should be percolating among all of the people that are part of the church. Does that make right? Everybody should be thinking, oh man, what does this mean for me? And who does it mean, who might God be calling me to, and how can I work that out? So I say this all the time. Your job is not to help me with my ministry. My job is to help you in whatever ministry God has called you to, but it's not my job to provide the platform for that ministry. So we just have to be careful, right? We have to be careful about distinguishing. So let's just stop and talk for a minute. What are your thoughts listening to all of that? How's that land on you? Where am I wrong? Tell me where I'm wrong. Or what are I knew this would be hard. Let's try though, okay? Let's try. Yes, which we need, by the way. Let's don't Tammy would kill me if that meant that nobody volunteers for kids because I said that. But anyway, keep going. Yes. Okay, but what's another alternative though? Do you think? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Great. Uh-huh. Never true. Molly, did you say it's never true? Yeah, that's never true, right? Yeah. Yes. There's a vulnerability to it, for sure. Yes. So what do you tell me? That's Connie. Connie's our office manager for sure. She runs everything around here. Y'all don't know that? Yeah, and we do, and we. No, it's not on me. No, it's not on me. I'm not. This is not my therapy session. I'm not complaining. If that's how that came off, then I really didn't communicate that well. My concern is that we had this conversation in our staff meeting the other day about, I think our staff can kind of feel this. We had an hour and 40-minute staff meeting yesterday, and we didn't talk about a single person in the church. We just talked about the calendaring and logistics and all that kind of stuff. And it was really upsetting to me. First of all, that we had an hour and 40-minute staff meeting. It's only supposed to be an hour, but I can't seem to get those meetings to be on track. But we could just feel a sense of just being pushed into things that are necessary, but that are not at the core of what I'm having a hard time saying what I'm trying to say. You'll help me. What am I trying to say? Yes, we have to put some focus there. There is something in us to, yes, that's right, James. So he said the bark is not where we should be putting our focus. Who cares about the bark, right? The bark is dead. The bark is there just to protect what's living on the inside. So in some cases, who cares about that stuff? But if you're not careful, you can begin to care about that stuff as if it's the most important stuff. Whether that's buildings or whether it's sacred cow type things in the church that have just been there forever. Jeff? Push back.
No, I'm not pushing back because I don't understand. Please clarify.
Okay.
Macro.
I think it's all of it.
Are we talking micro, the neighborhood? I guess I'm a little.
I'm talking about the way that the church. I didn't finish my story. What we kind of came to this conclusion at the end of the staff meeting is, well, we're just growing, and I said, I don't know that we're growing, we're aging. And what happens to a church as it ages is it becomes less. I can't think of the word. What's that? Well, hopefully not less vibrant, but yes, sometimes. Yeah, no. Sure, outward focus, but less organic, less relational, less spontaneous. Right? And some of it is just volume. Right? So great, we can no longer, so what happens is we can't any longer just rely upon people to be meeting the people that are new to the church just in the pew as they come, right? Whereas for a long time, whether it was just that we were a smaller church, or to be honest, when you're church planting, you're like, the only reason you're there is to meet new people. Now you come to church to see your friends. See, something changes. And so what you have to do then is you realize, oh gosh, there are people who are falling through the cracks, so we need to come up with a team. We need to come up with a ministry. We need to come up with something, right? Because we're trying to do the thing that was naturally happening before. And that's good and it's necessary until you just start to live in the service of the thing you've created rather than the outcome that thing was meant to fix, to bring about.
But do we have markers for that? I mean, how do we know?
Right.
But I would like to disagree, and I would like to push back because I have recently been in more committees and more things, and I feel like you and Jonathan have said several things the same over and over that I'm starting to disagree with. And I feel like maybe that's why you like Brad a little bit. But there are a lot of new people, and there are a lot of more people, but they are interested, and there are people seeing the new people.
There
And
are.
I mean,
No, I'm saying
I
it's
want
it's
more
necessary.
people like coming, and I just think that maybe there is a large group of people that fall into what you're describing, but I also feel like there is a huge group of people that are still
Oh yeah, yeah, and I'm not. And please don't hear me. I'm not saying I think this is where we are necessarily. I'm just making sure. I'm just like warning us of the potential danger. Johnny, and then
Yeah, one of the quintessential challenges for a session is to how to identify and
right.
assimilate new people. They are always going to be behind the eight ball no matter what you come up with.
Yeah.
It's up to us when we're here to not go to our buddies and talk the whole time, but go find that person that you don't know, I don't know, and welcome them. You know, if we don't do that, they'll never be able to catch up. So it's just being intentional on our part, not to catch up with our best friend, but not do that and go see some people we don't know and welcome them in.
And the more people that are doing that, the better.
We all do.
I was, you know, romanticizing what it was to be a church plant. It was also hard.
Oh yeah, no doubt.
You know, I remember Johnny and I, not Johnny, um, in doing Sunday school, we lost a kid. Yeah, was it Johnny? No, we lost a kid in the bathroom at the high
At the
school.
high school.
Yeah, and we had that big roller in the art room, and we were trying to teach 5-year-olds. And so there's that energy that we put towards all of that
Right.
now that should be moving towards other things now that we have a safe environment. We're not
Right.
worried about them turning over, you know, a machine in the art room with the kindergartners. And
Yes.
so, you know, there's that. But you're right. We were so, if we didn't meet people, who knew how long we were going to last as a church?
Yes. And so I guess another way of saying what I'm trying to say is part of the aging process of the church is that every movement has to eventually organize or the movement dies out, right? You have to organize. But but what you're doing in organizing is trying to preserve the beautiful, organic, creative thing that's happening. But what typically happens, and what I'm not saying we're there, I'm not complaining, I'm just saying, I'm just trying to warn us so that we can be prayerful and we can be repenting where we need to. But what typically happens is you begin to rely upon the organizational parts of it. And you stop doing the beautiful, organic kind of.
It's the tension between being covenantal and being evangelistic.
In the church, you mean?
Within the church.
Yeah.
Because it becomes easier to become inwardly covenantal because that's where we're all comfortable. That's really, in my mind, is a word for the structure, whereas we lose the organic
Right.
approach of being evangelistic. And how do you manage being both covenantal and evangelistic at the same time?
Good. Yeah, and becoming internally focused is one of the I don't want to equate the two, but it is definitely one of the byproducts of just more and more energy having to go into the maintenance and the running of programs rather than just the people ministry, right?
I mean, you saw it in the early church, which is why the apostles had to go appoint deacons
Yeah,
to care for infrastructure needs of the people.
that's right.
And so there's always this tension. There's always going to be
That's the point I'm trying to make.
right, between having appropriate structure versus being overstructured.
That's right.
And I think it's just always going to be there.
See, I think you should go back to, I think it was week 1 with your Venn diagram,
Yeah, yeah.
and you should have
Structure. Yeah, and you're looking for that. You're looking for that kind of middle part there, right?
And but I think also, like I said, the markers are key. I think we, in our goals here, have some markers that to be aware of.
That's right.
Because if you start, I mean, the bark is important. You can go back to that analogy.
It is.
But at the same time, it protects the tree.
It is.
It serves a purpose.
That's right.
But if you get too many holes in the bark, then that's a marker that you need to be.
Yeah, because without the bark, the living stuff dies. So the bark is important. Good. Good. This is I want I've been thinking about this forever. You've been thinking about it for 20 minutes. Okay, so I don't expect you to be all the way to where Vicky, what were you going to say? That's right.
But I think Tim would say right now that the structure of a parenting and marriage class that meets every Tuesday for X number of weeks at this time allows space for those relationships to form.
Yeah, it might. It might. Mhm. 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 That's right. Right. Good. So, and the key is to build enough, to put enough in place to where it sustains the thing that drew you in to begin with. Right. Enough to sustain it, to not eclipse it and take over and become the thing itself. Right. Right. That's right. That's right. And there are delivery systems, and there's logistical things that have to happen to make that happen.
I'll just give you some positive feedback. I'll give you some real time.
Please.
Fairly new to Redeemer the last 4 Sundays, and I felt very welcome.
Yeah.
All you guys that have come up and said hi and taken step out of maybe your comfort zone to introduce yourself to me, so I appreciate it. So you guys are doing a good job from a real time perspective. So I appreciate it. And I think it's important to get plugged in, or try to get people plugged in as best you can, and all the opportunities that are there to help do life together in community and all that stuff, and organically nurturing a new member to the church family and so forth. But
Great. No, thank you. That's very encouraging. I appreciate that. One more, Ben.
Sure. So I'm just a little bit ahead of Chaz as far as going to be coming here
Yeah.
not growing callous to
Right.
objectives, and I think that leadership is really on track with that. But just like what Vicki was saying, taking personal responsibility. It's that intentionality that really not just drew us in, but made us feel like part of the community in a very short amount of time, where we've been other places for years that we never felt that connection.
And I'm so grateful for that. So thank you guys for being encouraging. That's really kind. And just so that you understand, and again, what are we aiming at? Are we aiming at no parenting classes? No. What do we want to be? We want to be this movement that's unleashing people empowered by the Spirit inside and outside the church with the good news of Jesus to impact the place where we live. That's what we're after. And so it's this dance. But just so you know where I'm coming from, I am a little bit paranoid because I live in this world. The church planting is what I do, and I just am very aware of what typically what typically happens in churches as they begin to age. And I'm just wanting to sound the warning to just for us to continue to push towards just push towards these things. But here's the thing, okay, is what these guys just said. So we're not anti-program, we're not anti-institutionalism. We want to be careful not to become overly programmed, overly institutionalized. We don't want ministry to get bottlenecked because it has to go through the pastor or the leaders, right? We don't. In other words, we don't want you to wait around to get approval from us to do what God has called you to do. That's the way to just quench the Spirit, just like turn the Spirit off, right? To think that we have to manage, control, and oversee all of that. Okay, we want to unleash the gifts of the Spirit through the people of the church, but at the same time, it's possible to be underprogrammed. It's possible to be anti-institutionalism, and it's the danger of radical individualism. And honestly, the irony is this is the thing that I'm most concerned about. This is the thing that I really wanted to have the time to talk about tonight, is the way that people are now relating to institutions in very negative, counterproductive ways. Remember 2 weeks ago we talked about expressive individualism. Jonathan talked to us about it, and it's this idea that the truth is inside. Outside is just feelings, right? For thousands of years, we've believed that feelings are what are inside and the truth is outside. Now we believe that truth is inside, feelings are what is outside. And so you don't find happiness by conforming to external norms and roles and expectations. You got to go inside, discover the truth, discover your true self, and then express it in whatever creative way you can think of. It's how identity works, it's how morality works, it's how sexuality works. Any external norm is oppressive. Each person should have unlimited freedom to live authentically. But here's the thing, it's also affecting the way institutions work. It's affecting institutions as well. It's so easy to see the weird parts of expressive individualism in the most extreme cases. I ran across a couple of, it's just insane. There's this guy, Ollie London. He's a social media influencer who's non-binary, and he's a white dude from the UK, but he identifies as Korean. So he's explained himself as being trained. No, it's really not something we should laugh at, but he describes himself as transracial. He spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on surgeries on his quest to become 100% Korean. Or there was a story CNN ran about two penguins. I forget what zoo it is at, but two apparently same-sex penguins who chose one another as their mates. And here's one of the quotes from the people there at the zoo. They said, "The penguins are free to choose who they want to spend their time with and pair with. And in their case, they chose each other. We support and encourage each animal to make its own choices when choosing their mates." It's insane. It's just kind of, and we can read that and think, what in the world is happening in the world? But what we don't realize, what we don't see, is the way we're all being shaped by these things, by this hyper-individualism. And it shows up most clearly in the way we relate to and the way we belong to institutions, or that, in fact, we really no longer belong. Robert Putnam wrote a book that's become famous a number of years ago now called Bowling Alone. That's just the name of the book. And his whole premise is that more people than ever are bowling, but bowling leagues are basically non-existent. So people are bowling, but they're not bowling together as a social activity with one another. And he used that to kind of really get inside of hyper-individualism and the way we no longer kind of belong to things anymore, and we're just all kind of going our separate ways and living our lives. Okay? U11 has written about this as well. I would commend his writings to you, and I'm drawing primarily from his thoughts here, but he says we live in an age of criticizing and tearing down institutions. Think about it. This is what we do, right? And when I use the word institution, I mean things like government, school boards, but even things like PTAs, HOAs, even marriage and family, church, of course. All of these institutions, these ways of belonging to each other and working together for good, are under attack. And so Levin makes the argument that the way forward, the way to recovery, is to rebuild and reinforce the structures that hold us together, to learn how to belong to one another again by a common participation in some sort of institution, to approach the things we belong to with the expectation they would shape us, that they would have expectations and roles, and that we would be subject to those things in our belonging to whatever the thing is we belong to. So if you're familiar with the Gospel Coalition, they ran an article towards the end of 2020. Brett McCracken made the argument that we are relating, listen to this, he said we are relating to institutions in radically new ways. Instead of expecting formation, we expect affirmation. That instead of belonging and saying, okay, I'm here, shape me, now we belong, we say, celebrate me. We used to think of institutions as molds. This is his analogy. He said we would think of them as molds that would shape people's character and habits. So church, for example, right? To belong to a church was to step into the expectations and the roles and the responsibilities that the church would give you, and allow your life and your calendar and all of this to be shaped by those expectations. I mean, listen, it's just as simple. This sounds like legalism. I want to be careful, and I mean, but it really is just as simple. When I was a kid, if you belonged to a church, you were there every Sunday. I mean, it just was the thing. I mean, my dad and I have had season tickets to Florida State football games since I was 2 or 3 years old, and that's a 4.5-hour drive. And back then, all of the games were at night. And yet, we would get up on a Saturday morning and drive all the way to Tallahassee, hang out there for the day, watch the game, drive back, get back at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning because we had church the next day. And he was a deacon, and he had responsibilities, and he wanted me there, and something has changed. I mean, something has changed. We no longer relate to the things we belong to as molds. We no longer expect them to be molds that demand things from us, that you know what a mold, like that press on us and press us into a certain way of living and being and behaving. Now, and this is Brett McCracken's contention, and it's powerful, he says, now we no longer think of them as molds, we think of them as platforms. So we think of institutions as platforms that allow people to be themselves and display themselves and further their personal brand. So we belong to things not to be shaped. We expect the things we belong to be shaped around us. Or the way he put it is we belong performatively, not formatively. Okay? So what's changed? I want to talk about it, but give me 1 minute to kind of lay this out a little bit more. I think at least part of what's changed is expressive individualism. I mean, institutions now are expected to serve the individual's needs and wants. The individual doesn't serve the purpose and mission of the institution, right? You see how this changes? Belonging used to be a process where the individual went through a process of change to better fit the culture and identity of the institution. Now, the burden of belonging falls squarely on the institution. It's supposed to change in order to meet the expectations of every individual member, which is why you have Christian organizations on Christian colleges across our country having to figure out, LBGQ stuff going on there and having to change. Like, in other words, they're being forced because of the pressure that are coming from LBGTQ students to include them and to change, to adapt to, welcoming and accepting them, rather than those institutions being kind of immune from that because there's a certain core identity to the institution, right? Does that make sense? I mean, think about the family. The family is our first institution. We learn to belong everywhere else by belonging to a family, because in a family, every member is given a role, a set of relations to everybody else, a body of responsibilities, their obligations and duties, and that's what you learn in a family. By belonging, you learn the character and communication skills that are necessary for the rest of your life, but it is because there's a certain concrete form and structure to the family, designed by God. Okay, well, what happens, do you see, what happens if all of that becomes fluid? What happens if the form of the family becomes fluid? What if the family and the roles and so forth become a function of expressive individualism? I mean, what, and this isn't, no fault, single parents are my heroes, but what happens in a single parent family? Challenges, right? Challenges for the kids, for everybody, because it's just not the way it's meant to function. But what if there are two dads and no mom? What if individualism, even inside a family, becomes more important than belonging? It's what's happening to families all over our society. So see, families form us by constraining us. Has anybody ever had that? Have you had that experience in your family? Hello? Right? Jamie and Jonathan knew me back then. I don't know if anybody else knew me. I was a much more selfish person until I became a dad. But that's how it works, right? No, well, yeah, it should work that way. But that's what's supposed to happen. Dads aren't supposed to selfishly leave the family because they get romantically entangled with somebody else. They're supposed to learn how to not live selfishly in the very act of becoming a father towards their kids in a way that shapes their whole life. But that's always been happening. But now it's this enormous problem because of the way hyper-individualism, expressive individualism has taken root in so many people and so much of the way we think about life. It's scary. It really is pretty frightening. But it has enormous implications for the way we do church too. Can you think about what those are? What do you think? Let's discuss this for a minute. What do you interact with me about that part? How do you see that being a threat to the idea of institutions and the role, the formative role institutions are meant to have on our lives? Perfect example. Right. 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 That's great, and that's a great example of the Boy Scouts have always been what they've been forever and ever and ever. But we are now in an age where individuals who might not agree with kind of the general sense of norms, values, culture of that organization demand that in other words, they demand that the organization change to meet their needs rather than that they would change to conform to the organization's standards, values. That's right. That's yes. What do you mean? Yeah, who does that, right? No, it's part of. What about our church vows? Gigi said, "What about our church vows?" Right? We don't just join. We don't just informally join in membership with one another. We take vows to one another, which is a powerful thing in a time and an age where you can give your word and take it back whenever you want to. That itself is part of the expressive individualism. Yeah, sure. In anything. Right. Mm-hmm. 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 But Jamie, by definition, that's what it means to belong. Right, to belong to something that you serve that doesn't necessarily serve you. Amen. That's exactly where I'm going. Is that the church has to be a place that is shaping people who can belong not just to this institution, but to all the other institutions they are a part of in ways that are supportive and actually building up those things, restoring them to the place in society they've meant to hold. Vicky? Well, yeah. So what I would say to you is, if you or I, if we truly have committed to belonging to this institution, Redeemer Winter Haven, then the very first commitment you've made is to call yourself a sinner. Right? That's membership vow number one. So by definition, living in any other way than to be humble, than to be confessing your own sin before you critique other people, than to ever be living in a way that you're standing above, looking down at someone else, is you living actually in expressive individualism rather than actually the belonging to the organization that you've taken vows to belong to. If that makes sense, it's showing you the ways that your heart is still not connecting the dots there, if that makes sense. Is that vague? Is that open? No, right? Does that make sense? Okay. Anybody else thoughts? I'm breaking my prayer 15 or 20% prayer or whatever. Is it 25%? 25% prayer rule tonight because I want to have plenty of time to talk about this. Okay. So what do we do? What do we do? How do we do that? Do you have any idea? How do we become a place that demands that of other people? Yeah, how do we become a place that really shapes people in the way that you're talking about them needing to be shaped? In what yeah, great. I would say that's a tremendous cultural value would be that this is a place where people listen instead of just expressing opinions. Good. Okay.
But stop being so afraid
Mm.
of things. As a parent, there's times you just go, oh, I don't want to hear that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm afraid of where this conversation with my child is going to go, and yet the realization of it is God's got it and I don't. And to be afraid is just to miss so many things.
Mm. It's great. Oh yeah. Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah. Um, so I think there are things that we as individuals need to do that you guys are hitting on, and then there are things that the institution, the organization itself needs to do. First, we need to push back against expressive individualism wherever we find it. Like, we have to be aware of this being the waters we swim in. It is the air we breathe. It is just everywhere. We are inundated with it all the time, and it's affecting us in ways we don't even realize. And we can look at the crazy things and say those people are crazy, but there are seemingly innocuous, less dramatic ways that we are doing the same thing that people are doing, and we're just like more respectable than they are in the way we're doing that. And we just need to be aware of that. Secondly, I think the institutions themselves, and I think, Chad, this is what you're getting at, we need to not be afraid to be a mold. I mean, the church has to be a place that teaches people what it means to belong, to be committed, to embrace responsibilities and obligations, because it's better to give than to receive. Jesus said that, right? I mean, Paul said that, but quoting Jesus, it's better to give than to receive. And so the church cannot cater to the platform demands of the people. We've got to be okay with saying, this is who we are. If you decide to join with us, then we hope your belonging will change you, but you're not going to change us. Right? I mean, we don't want to be a big church. And so if you want to be a part of a big church, then maybe this is not the church for you. We want to be a church that's safe for sinners. That's one of the values we've set. We want lost people to feel welcome here. If you're looking for a church where everybody has got their act together and looks pretty, then this might not be the church for you, right? I mean, we could go through this long litany of things. We've got to not be afraid to be a mold. Well, what's our mold? Well, in many ways, that's what we've been spending these weeks talking about. Our mold is that this will be a place where prayer is a priority, where we're committed to evangelism, where genuine Christianity, knowing, being, and doing, is being worked out in formative practices that are shaping us after the image of God and Jesus. This is a place that's going to always value embodiment and embodied faith versus the technology that's doing so much. And so we're going to go right after technology. We're going to keep, if you don't want us talking about we're going to keep talking about technology because it's a big deal, right? This is a place that's going to value institutions and say belonging is important and warn you of expressive individualism. And it's going to be a place where we're committed to the multiplication, not only of churches and church planting, but the multiplication of discipleship groups and community groups and the gospel bearing fruit, so that we don't just get to stay in our little safe little friendship groups and holy huddles, but we actually have to break out of those things and multiply, because Jesus said, unless the seed falls into the ground and dies, it remains alone, but if it dies, it bears much fruit. So the fruitfulness of the gospel is dependent upon our dying to our own personal preferences and opening up for new people to come in and experience the things that we've experienced and actually multiplying toward gospel growth. Right? That's the mold. And we have to be unashamed about that being the mold and say, look, that's who we're going to be. And we would love the opportunity to talk you into the beauty of belonging to a group of people like that. But if it's not for you, that's fine. There are plenty of great churches in the city. Maybe you ought to go belong somewhere else. The pastors, we release you into the greater work of what God is doing in the world. Tim Rice, who's, he will meet with people and say, he has a ministry of inviting people to consider, I'd love to find a great church for you to belong to, but I don't think it's this one. And we got to not be afraid to be a mold. I think for you it means, for us, it means making membership even a bigger deal than it already is. Membership's kind of on the way out. Church membership, marriage, like the formality of relationships and belonging is kind of on the way out, and we need to make it even a bigger deal. We take vows, we have responsibilities, we have to hold on to those responsibilities and demand from one another that we keep our word to one another, right? Just demand that. So if you see some of the goals, like goal number 1, I gave you that, if you have the sheet there, goal number 1, clean up the membership roll by summer 2022. The reality is, Jonathan could tell you better than I could, but due to COVID and some other kinds of things, we have all kinds of people who have taken vows, and one of those vows is to support the church in its worship and work to the best of your ability, who haven't been here in 6 months, 9 months, 2 years. We've got to do as leaders the work of saying, look, do you intend to continue in keeping, to the obligation that you have made to this church? And if not, it's okay. But we need to formally disassociate from one another, to calling people to keeping their word and to the obligation that they've given to themselves. Does that make sense? I mean, in making membership a priority, because we are so anemic in our belonging that we need helps to belong to one another, and that's what those membership vows do. And then I wrote some other things there. Develop a membership class, a new membership class material, because we haven't done that in so long. And then what we'd like to do is take the entire church through that new membership stuff over the next 3 years, so that everybody can be reminded of what it is this church is trying to do and be. Develop a communication strategy and platform to better communicate expectations and encourage engagement, like a jobs list. Can you imagine like a volunteer jobs list, corkboard somewhere online, where you can know this is the help we need. These are the places we need volunteers. And then even create specific roles, even with job descriptions for lay people in the church, especially women. And develop training modules for this role. So if you're going to be a community group leader, here are the expectations of a community group leader, and here's the training that we'll offer you. And I mean, really asking you to jump in, to really engaging with the obligations of belonging. And for us as leaders, the reason that institutions are doing so poorly, a lot of it has to do with the credibility of the people who are leading those. And so I'm here to say that the men and the women who are leaders in this church, they are striving to be people who are worthy of being followed and who are trustworthy, and who would lead and make decisions in such a way that if you would give them the chance, they're doing so to try to build trust. Okay? Because that's important. Because if you don't trust your leaders, then how could you ever really belong to the thing? I mean, one of the vows. Do you remember what one of the vows is? Do you submit yourself to the government and discipline of the church? So what does it mean to live under spiritual authority? And what does it mean when your life is sideways and the people you've submitted yourself to come and say you're wrong, and you say, I don't care if you think I'm wrong, I'm going to do it the way I want to. We got to hold one another to living a different way. And we have to be leaders who are worthy of being followed, so that when we come and confront you about things, you don't think we're mean. You know we're doing it because we love you. Right? So that together we can figure out how to re-engage in the habits of belonging, not just for the sake of what our experience will be here, but for the sake of being people who can go out into the world and not just evangelize, but can go. I mean, talk to Brad. Brad would tell you the city of Winter Haven is dying for social institutions, people coming together and organizing themselves towards creative, concrete ways of blessing the city. That's where Kiwanis came from years ago, right? Brad, help me. That's what all of these, what's that? Yeah, Masons. Masons are shady, but if you're a Mason, I apologize. but these, right? But these places, even, believe it or not, even fraternities, on college campuses 150 years ago were meant to be something other than what they've become. But we need to be people who can go and can be a part of revitalizing these sorts of institutions so that our world will become less fractured. What would make Winter Haven, whether a Republican or a Democrat ultimately is in the White House in 2024, really will not make a whole lot of difference here in Winter Haven. What will is if this city could have people who would be committed to building structures of togetherness here locally for the benefit and blessing of this place. It's a lost art, and we need to be on the leading edge of it. And it starts with how we think about church, okay? So that's why we're talking about these things. All right, I've gone over my time, and we didn't pray at all. So forgive me, but let's close in prayer, and then you guys can hang around, just go get your kids, and then you're welcome to stay for as long as you want. So Father, thank you for the way that you invite us into the very belonging of the Trinity between Father, Son, and Spirit, that the same love that you share with us, and you invite us into that kind of togetherness. And so forgive us for where we allow our own individualism and pride and selfishness to get in the way, where we just hold on to what we want instead of seeking to serve and to care for others. Jesus, you were God, but did not consider your godness something to be held on to, but made yourself nothing and became like a servant, obedient to the point of death. And Paul says to us, have among you the same mind. And so make that so. And may the result be that as we go down into nothingness, that the seed would not remain alone, but would, in fact, bring life. And we pray it in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you. One more week. Next week, we're going to have dinner together next week to close it out like we did the first week. And so be looking for that. We'd love to have you come back and finish this out with us, okay?